Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In a room accustomed to carefully chosen phrases and diplomatic restraint, 7 words landed with the force of a royal decree. Meghan will never stand where my mum stood. The silence afterward was heavier than the statement itself. Meghan froze. Charles looked down, and within seconds, everyone understood that Anne had drawn a boundary no apology could easily erase. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan had entered the closed family discussion, expecting arguments about protocol, not identity. Harry had warned her that the Windsor Remembrance event carried weight, but he had not expected the conversation to turn this personal. The proposed commemorative position was not simply a place in a procession. Within this fictional ceremony, it represented symbolic closeness to Queen Elizabeth II, and to the values the late monarch had embodied for decades. Anne saw that space as sacred family memory, not a role to be reassigned for convenience. Charles reached toward the briefing folder and stopped before touching it. The king knew the document mattered because it contained the suggested order for the event, a planning paper showing where senior family members would stand and in what sequence they would appear. Across the table, Meghan held Anne's gaze and asked, "Is that really what you think of me?" The Princess Royal did not flinch. "This is about what Mum represented," she answered. And Harry immediately understood that his wife was being measured against a standard no living royal could ever fully meet. William remained silent long enough for the tension to sharpen. Then the prince asked one question that changed the direction of the meeting. Who proposed the position? He was not defending Meghan, and he was not supporting Anne. He wanted the source. Harry turned toward him at once, while Charles lowered his eyes again, as if he already feared the answer. A senior aide spoke. The request had not been accidental, informal, or the result of a seating mistake. Someone had specifically asked that Meghan be considered for the ceremonial place associated, in this fictional commemoration, with the late Queen's closest representative. The admission landed harder than Anne's first sentence, because it proved the conflict had begun before anyone entered the room. Anne already knew who had made the request. She had known for several days. Her statement was not a sudden explosion, but the final response to a private incident she had carried in silence. And 3 members of the family knew exactly what had pushed her beyond restraint. Behind the confrontation were 3 women, carrying 3 completely different versions of the monarchy. Anne carried memory, Meghan carried resentment and unfinished belonging. And hovering over both of them was Queen Elizabeth II, whose absence somehow commanded the room more powerfully than any living person. Anne believed she was defending her mother's legacy. Meghan believed she was being permanently punished. Neither woman was prepared to surrender what the moment represented. Princess Anne had spent years treating certain traditions as extensions of her mother's lifetime of service, not as prizes that could simply be reassigned. To her, ceremonial spaces carried emotional history. A royal commemoration, meaning an official family event created to honor a person or moment of national importance, was never only about positioning. It was about continuity, sacrifice, and memory. Every gesture connected back to a woman who had carried the crown through decades of pressure without allowing personal grievance to become public duty. Meghan saw the same event through a completely different wound. After years away from regular royal duties, she viewed the Windsor gathering as one of the few remaining chances to show that she and Harry still had a meaningful family connection. The Duchess understood that returning for one ceremony could not repair everything, but she believed presence itself mattered. Being excluded again would not feel like protocol. It would feel like proof that the door had never truly reopened. Harry watched his wife absorb the words and felt his anger rising beneath his restraint. He understood why his aunt guarded Elizabeth's memory so fiercely, yet he also knew how Meghan would hear that sentence. Not as a technical objection, not as a disagreement about tradition. She would hear it as a verdict on whether she had ever belonged at all. The prince wanted to challenge Anne, but he knew one emotional response could turn a family disagreement into something far more destructive. Meghan waited until they were alone before asking the question that had been building inside her. Did she ever intend to accept me? Harry hesitated. That brief silence hurt more than any immediate answer could have done. She turned away, fighting the anger in her voice, while he admitted the dispute had moved beyond one ceremony. His aunt was no longer resisting a position, she was resisting an idea. William discovered just how dangerous that idea had become when a private briefing reached him shortly afterward. The prince learned that Anne's concern had actually started earlier, after a conversation comparing Meghan's modern public influence with Elizabeth's ability to connect across generations. What began as a discussion about communication had traveled through several people before reaching the Princess Royal. Anne had heard something much harsher. She believed Meghan was being described as the family figure capable of occupying the emotional space once held by her mother. That comparison struck her as deeply offensive. Yet even that might have remained a private irritation if one incident at Windsor had not transformed resentment into outright resistance. The argument appeared to be about one sentence, but its fuse had been burning for days, and the moment that lit it happened during a quiet rehearsal almost no one outside the family knew had taken place. Every family fracture has a moment that later feels inevitable. For Anne, it came not during an argument, not during a public ceremony, but inside a nearly empty Windsor room days earlier. She had arrived expecting a routine rehearsal. Instead, she heard one suggestion that stopped her cold. Nobody shouted. Nobody openly challenged anyone. Yet when Anne walked away, something inside her had hardened permanently. Princess Anne arrived 4 days before the family confrontation, expecting nothing more than a final check of the Windsor Remembrance Ceremony. The rehearsal was meant to settle timing, placement, and the order in which relatives would join the concluding tribute. A remembrance ceremony, in simple terms, is an official gathering designed to honor the life and service of someone who has died. For Anne, that distinction mattered because this event was not about pageantry. It was about her mother. The tension began when one organizer suggested placing Meghan in a position that had become emotionally linked to continuity with Queen Elizabeth II's reign. It was not a constitutional role and carried no legal authority, but within the family, it had come to symbolize closeness to the late monarch's legacy. The suggestion was framed as a powerful message of reconciliation. Anne heard something else entirely. She heard her mother's memory being used as a tool to repair a modern family dispute. Meghan entered partway through the discussion and immediately sensed the strain. She saw Anne standing near the contested position and assumed the objection went further than placement. "I am not trying to take anything from anyone," she said. The Princess Royal answered without softening her tone. "Then don't let them make it look as though you are." Meghan stiffened. She had hoped this appearance might signal that years of distance had not erased every family bond. Instead, she suddenly felt as though even showing up carried an accusation. Anne left believing the matter had been stopped. It had not. Later that day, a documented planning note reached her confirming that Meghan's name remained under consideration because someone senior had instructed staff to leave the option open until Charles personally reviewed it. The princess understood immediately that her objection had not been treated as final. Harry made the conflict even more painful when his private support for the idea became known. He believed a prominent place for Meghan could demonstrate reconciliation at the highest level and show that the family was capable of moving beyond old wounds. To him, it represented healing. To Anne, it transformed Elizabeth's symbolic place into a bargaining instrument. The wound was now complete. When Anne later entered the family meeting and discovered that the proposal had survived, she knew polite resistance had failed. This time, she would make herself impossible to misunderstand, even if Harry and Meghan carried the pain of her words long after the meeting ended. The rehearsal created the grievance, but the family meeting transformed it into war, because Meghan would not quietly accept Anne's verdict once the meaning behind those 7 words became clear. Meghan had absorbed criticism before, but this was different. Anne had not questioned a decision, a dress code, or a schedule. She had drawn a line between Meghan and the most revered woman in modern royal memory. And this time, Meghan refused to leave the room, carrying that judgment silently. She turned back toward the Princess Royal, steadied herself, and forced the confrontation everyone else had been desperately hoping to avoid. Charles tried to pull the meeting back toward the ceremonial proposal, but Meghan stopped him. She told the king the discussion could not continue until Anne made one thing clear. Was she rejecting the position, or was she rejecting her? That difference mattered, because a disagreement over placement could still be negotiated, while a judgment about personal worth could deepen wounds that had already divided the family for years. William understood that immediately. The future king knew this was no longer about a single commemoration. It was about whether the family could disagree without turning disagreement into permanent exclusion. Anne answered carefully, but she did not retreat. She told Meghan she was not judging her as a woman, a wife, or a mother. Her objection was to deliberate symbolism. The Princess Royal believed the ceremonial role was being used to suggest continuity with Queen Elizabeth II, and she refused to accept that connection. Meghan fired back that symbolism had often been used against her before, especially when tradition was treated as flexible for others, but absolute when she was involved. Meghan held Anne's gaze. "I never asked to become your mother," she said. The words cut through the room with unexpected force. Anne's expression tightened. "Then understand why no one should package you as her successor." Harry moved his chair forward, ready to intervene, but his wife placed a hand on his arm and stopped him. She wanted the answer without protection. For once, she wanted the argument to belong entirely to the two women at its center. Charles finally broke the silence. Through his own account during the closed family discussion, the king admitted that he had personally allowed the proposal to remain active because he hoped one symbolic gesture might soften years of hostility between Harry's household and the wider family. To him, the idea had been a peace offering. He had not intended to replace memory. He had intended to create a path back. Anne reacted more sharply to Charles than she had to Meghan. She told the monarch that he knew exactly what the position represented to her, yet he still allowed staff to turn Elizabeth's legacy into a tool for reconciliation. Suddenly, the real divide became impossible to ignore. William saw it first. Meghan had defended herself, but the deepest conflict was no longer hers. It now sat between a brother desperate to heal the family and a sister determined to protect what she believed should never be negotiated. Meghan had defended herself, but Anne's next target was not across the table, it was at the head of it, where Charles suddenly faced the uncomfortable truth that the decision had always been his. Kings can approve ceremonies. They can alter schedules, positions, invitations, and precedents. But Charles discovered that authority becomes far more complicated when the thing being negotiated is grief. Anne was not challenging his crown, she was challenging his judgment. And as the room emptied around them, brother and sister were left facing a painful question neither title nor protocol could solve. Who had the right to decide what their mother's memory could be used to represent? Charles remained seated after Meghan and Harry left, while Princess Anne stayed beside the table. As king, he held final authority over participation in the Windsor ceremony, meaning he could approve who attended, where they stood, and what formal role each person would hold. But that power did not erase the emotional force of his sister's objection. She had spent a lifetime beside Elizabeth, and everyone in the family understood that her defense of the late monarch's legacy carried a weight no written instruction could easily silence. William stayed, because the decision would not end with his father's reign. The prince knew that whatever Charles normalized now could later become part of the institutional culture he inherited. Traditions often survive because one generation decides which boundaries matter and which ones can bend. He was watching not only as a son and nephew, but as the future custodian of choices being made under extraordinary emotional pressure. Charles finally told Anne what had been driving him. "I am trying to repair this family before the bitterness becomes permanent." His sister did not answer immediately. Then she said reconciliation built on their mother's symbolic identity was not reconciliation at all. It was substitution. The king pushed back, insisting nobody was replacing Elizabeth. He wanted one gesture powerful enough to prove that Harry had not been pushed beyond the family forever. Anne's anger softened when Charles admitted the fear beneath his decision. He was afraid of losing his younger son completely. For a moment, she understood him not as monarch, but as a brother and father carrying a private failure. Still, she warned that grief could not become currency every time the family needed a gesture dramatic enough to dominate headlines. Her mother's memory, she said, could not be traded for temporary peace. William then asked the question that changed everything. Had Meghan herself requested the position? Charles answered immediately, no. The idea had come from palace planners, and it gained momentum only after Harry privately supported its message of reconciliation. Anne went quiet. That detail forced her to reconsider what she had assumed. Meghan had defended the opportunity once it was placed before her, but she had not designed the comparison. She had not created the symbolism. For the first time, the Princess Royal recognized that her 7 words may have struck far more personally than the facts justified. Anne did not withdraw her boundary. But somewhere else in the palace, Meghan was already deciding whether she would attend the ceremony at all. Charles could alter the arrangement with one decision, but the emotional damage had already escaped the room, and Meghan's next move threatened to turn a family disagreement into an irreversible separation. The first real consequence arrived without shouting. Meghan simply stopped negotiating. Hours after Anne's statement, she received the revised ceremonial proposal, read the page twice, and placed it face down. Harry waited for anger. Instead, he saw exhaustion. The fight over where she might stand had become proof of something deeper in her mind. Every attempt at reconciliation seemed capable of reopening the very wounds it was supposed to heal. Charles moved quickly once he understood how dangerous the symbolism had become. The king ordered the disputed position removed from consideration entirely rather than assigning it to someone else. That mattered because the place had become more than a ceremonial detail. Within this fictional event, it had come to represent continuity with Queen Elizabeth II's legacy. By leaving it unused, he hoped to stop the family from turning memory into competition. Meghan was offered another prominent position beside Harry, one designed to acknowledge their family connection without recreating the original controversy. Institutionally, it was meant as compromise. Emotionally, it felt like proof that her presence had once again become the problem everyone was trying to solve. Meghan read the revised arrangement privately with Harry and pushed the page toward him. She told him she would attend only if her presence would not become a referendum on whether she deserved to belong. The prince answered that walking away might allow everyone else to define the meaning of the moment for them. She looked at him for several seconds before admitting what had truly stayed with her. Anne had not said, "You cannot stand there." She had said, "You will never stand where my mum stood." Harry understood the difference. He admitted that he was angry with his aunt because the sentence sounded permanent, even though he also understood why his grandmother's memory remained deeply sensitive. Meghan told him that was exactly the problem. She could respect grief. What she could not accept was being made to carry the weight of it. Anne received word that Meghan was considering withdrawing from the ceremony altogether, and the reaction surprised even her. She did not feel vindicated. The Princess Royal felt uneasy. She had wanted the comparison stopped, not the woman erased from the event. Anne then asked William a question she should have asked days earlier. Had Meghan actually known what the original position symbolized before the rehearsal? The prince told her that, according to the documented planning account he had reviewed, the deeper significance had only been explained after the proposal was already being discussed. The truth struck hard. Anne had defended a principle she still believed in, but she was beginning to wonder whether she had aimed her anger at the wrong person. Before the ceremony could move forward, Anne asked for one private conversation with Meghan. No Charles, no Harry, no William, no aides. The public battle had been halted, but the private reckoning was only beginning. because Anne was about to enter that conversation carrying something far more difficult than anger. The possibility that she had gone too far. No courtiers stood nearby. No husbands waited to intervene. No king could soften the language before it landed. When Anne and Meghan finally sat alone, the entire conflict changed shape. One woman had spent days defending her mother's memory. The other had spent years believing the royal family had already decided what kind of woman she was. Now there were no institutions left to blame. Only two people, two wounds, and one sentence neither could pretend had meant nothing. Princess Anne had requested the conversation after learning that Meghan had not created the original ceremonial comparison. The Duchess agreed reluctantly, because one question still mattered more than the ceremony itself. Had Anne meant those 7 words as a permanent judgment of her place in the family? Charles's decision to leave the disputed position unused remained final, so neither woman had anything left to negotiate. The conversation was now about damage, not protocol. Anne did not hide behind formal language. "I meant the boundary. I regret the wound." Meghan said nothing at first. The princess explained that hearing her mother's symbolic position discussed as a device for reconciliation had felt deeply wrong. To her, Queen Elizabeth II's decades of service could not be reduced to a useful gesture for repairing another family conflict. The late monarch had carried duty through sacrifice, and her daughter believed some symbols should remain protected from modern bargaining. Meghan finally answered. She told Anne that the problem was not the boundary itself. It was the way the sentence had turned an argument about Elizabeth into a judgment about her. The Duchess admitted that every return to royal life already felt like an examination she was expected to fail. Every movement was measured against tradition. Every mistake seemed to become proof of something larger. Hearing "never" from Anne made that fear sound permanent. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she admitted something Meghan had not expected. She had misunderstood how the entire idea began. The princess had assumed the symbolic comparison was being pushed deliberately by Meghan or on her behalf. Instead, the proposal had been built around her before she fully understood what the position represented. That mistake did not change Anne's belief about the boundary, but it changed who deserved the blame. Meghan responded just as plainly. She had never wanted Elizabeth's place. What she wanted was acknowledgement that belonging to the family did not require pretending the difficult years had erased every relationship that existed before them. Anne finally gave her the distinction she had been asking for. She would not apologize for defending her mother's legacy, but she did apologize for making Meghan herself the target of that defense. Meghan accepted it. Their private conversation did not create affection, but it created something the monarchy had been missing for years: clarity. And when the story reached the outside world, that distinction would determine whether Anne was seen as cruel, courageous, or something far more complicated. By morning, the sentence no longer belonged to Anne. It belonged to broadcasters, columnists, crowds, critics, royal loyalists, and millions of people who had never been inside the room where it was spoken. 7 words became a national argument about grief, privilege, race, loyalty, reconciliation, and the limits of royal tradition. Yet the public heard the confrontation before it heard the private resolution, and for several hours, the monarchy seemed split down the middle again. Palace staff responded with a carefully worded statement confirming that Meghan would attend the Windsor commemoration beside Harry, while the disputed symbolic position remained unused. The statement focused on family remembrance rather than hierarchy. That distinction mattered because the ceremony had already become entangled with questions of status, belonging, and Elizabeth's legacy. By removing the position completely, Charles was trying to stop a private wound from becoming an official ranking of who was considered closest to the late Queen. Commentators divided almost immediately. Some described Princess Anne's words as the fierce reaction of a daughter protecting something she believed could never be replaced. Others argued that even if the principle was understandable, the phrase itself had made the dispute painfully personal. The disagreement spread because both interpretations contained something emotionally powerful. One centered on loyalty to Elizabeth, while the other focused on the damage caused when tradition is expressed as rejection. Harry watched the coverage beside Meghan and became increasingly frustrated. He saw headline after headline reduce days of complicated arguments into a simple feud between two women. The prince wanted to challenge the way the story was being framed, but his wife was calmer than he expected. Meghan now knew something the public did not. After her private conversation with Anne, she understood that the princess's intention and the wound created by her words were not exactly the same thing. Anne refused suggestions that she make a dramatic public apology. She believed doing so would turn a private clarification into another spectacle and create the impression that the family was still fighting over who had won. Instead, the Princess Royal accepted the revised arrangement and allowed the decision itself to carry the message. Outside Windsor Castle, the argument became impossible to ignore. Crowds gathered as broadcasters repeated the phrase, while one morning newspaper built its front page around the words, "Never where my mum stood." A private boundary had become the defining public line of the day. Then the tone shifted. Meghan and Anne arrived separately for the family gathering, yet neither avoided the other. Their willingness to enter the same event without another confrontation quietly weakened predictions of immediate rupture. The world still wanted a winner. But inside the family, Charles had made his decision, Anne had clarified her meaning, and Meghan had one final choice left. The headlines demanded a victor, but the final meaning of the confrontation would not be decided by newspapers. It would be decided by what Meghan did when the ceremony finally began. In the end, nobody stood where Elizabeth had stood. That was the answer. Not Anne, not Meghan, not another woman selected to make the symbolism easier. The place remained deliberately untouched, and in that absence the family finally understood what their argument had been trying to say all along. Honoring the late Queen did not require finding someone who could occupy her emotional space. Reconciliation did not require pretending the past had disappeared either. Charles kept the final arrangement exactly as he had decided. The symbolic position connected with Queen Elizabeth II remained unused, while Meghan attended beside Harry and was recognized as part of the family without being presented as anyone's replacement. That mattered, because the argument had never truly been about where one person stood. It had been about whether remembrance could be separated from succession, and whether reconciliation could happen without turning one woman's legacy into another woman's burden. Princess Anne accepted the arrangement because the central boundary she had fought to protect remained intact. Her mother's symbolic place had not been reassigned for publicity, institutional messaging, or the appearance of unity. Yet the princess also carried the knowledge that protecting a principle did not erase the damage caused by the way she had expressed it. Her words had been harsh. She no longer denied that. Anne encountered Meghan before the family gathering without aides or relatives between them. Neither woman reached for another dramatic conversation. The princess gave a small nod. Meghan returned it. That was enough. There was no embrace, because affection had not suddenly appeared, and there was no theatrical apology, because the private reckoning had already happened. What existed now was something quieter, a boundary understood by both sides. Harry noticed the exchange and felt the tension inside him ease. His wife had not been forced to erase herself to make peace, while his aunt had not been asked to surrender what Elizabeth's memory meant to her. The outcome was imperfect, but for once, imperfection felt more honest than another carefully staged display of unity. William later spoke privately with Charles and gave the king the clearest explanation of what had changed. Leaving the position empty, the prince said, had achieved something assigning it never could. It separated remembrance from succession and reconciliation from replacement. Charles finally understood that not every empty space within a family had to be filled simply because its absence was painful. Meghan's decision to attend prevented Anne's sentence from becoming the opening line of another permanent exile. She came without accepting the comparison, and the princess allowed her to come without demanding one. Neither woman surrendered her dignity. No one replaced the queen, because that was never a role anyone else could inherit. Anne protected the uniqueness of her mother's memory. Meghan defended her own place without claiming another woman's. Charles abandoned a flawed symbol of reconciliation. And the family found something smaller than perfect peace, but perhaps more believable. A way to stand together, without pretending they had forgotten what had divided them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.